Happy Easter. Um, Last week, we finished up chapter 4 of the book of Esther, not Easter, the book of Esther, where Esther had decided to go to the king. She had told Mordecai that he needed to go and fast, gather all the Jews in the capital city of Susa, the citadel, and have them fast and pray for 3 days. And so after 3 days, she said, I'll go to the king, and if I perish, I perish. If I die, I die. She decided, she made up in her mind that she would pay the ultimate sacrifice if this is what God wanted her to do. And so she went and she told Mordecai that she was going to do it. And her servants, as well as Mordecai and all of the Jews in the capital city, fasted and prayed for 3 days. So at the end of 3 days, we come to Esther chapter 5. And it says, Now it happened on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. So it was, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. So this is what Esther was afraid of. Esther was afraid that she would go into the inner court, the king would see her, and remember, she hasn't seen the king for 30 days. And she thinks she might have lost favor with the king. If he had not offered the scepter, had not offered the pardon, the law was to be executed because she wasn't called, and yet she went into the inner court of the king without him asking for. And so she goes and walks in, and she's standing there as he's sitting on his royal throne, which faces the front of the house so that he can see anyone who's coming in. She comes and she's in her royal robes, and she comes and she stands there. And the king still loves Esther, but she wasn't sure of that. And so he held out the scepter to her, giving her forgiveness and pardon. And so she comes and she touches the scepter, in other words, receiving that forgiveness. And the king said to her in verse 3, says, And the king said to her, What do you wish, O Queen Esther? And what is your request? It shall be given to you up to half of the kingdom. So Esther answered, If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him. Then the king said, Bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. Esther comes up, touches the scepter, and the king offers as much as he could give. He says, and a lot of the commentators, they think that, I'll give it to you up to half of the kingdom. This was more of a common gesture. It wasn't literal. He wasn't about to give her half of the kingdom. Just like in the book of, in the Gospels, whenever Herod offers it to Herodias' daughter. I couldn't think of her name, Herodias. He offered it. He wasn't really going to give her half the kingdom. But he's saying, you can ask a grand gesture and I'll give it to you. And we don't know why Esther didn't just flat out say, please don't kill my people. It might have been the people around her. It might have been the fact that she's still nervous about asking this for the king. You got to remember how high up in the government Haman was. Haman was second in command. And she's about to accuse him of trying to kill her. And so she's worried. And so I think she's still building courage. And so she says, I've prepared a banquet for you. You and Haman. Bring Haman. And we're not sure why she invited Haman. Maybe it was so that he would be there whenever she revealed what she was saying, to see how he reacted, maybe so that he would know who it was that he was attacking. We don't know. All we know is that the king and Haman were invited. And so the king, of course, he's like, well, all you want me to do is come to your banquet? Of course I'll come to your banquet. He says, go and get Haman quickly. He sends his servants. They go and get him, and they go to the banquet. And in verse 6, it says, and at the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, what is your petition? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Up to half of the kingdom? It'll be done. In other words, you can still ask this grand thing. What is it you want? It's like you're buttering me up for something. What do you want? I'll give it to you. You don't have to do this extra stuff. And in verse 7, Esther says, and Esther answered, my petition and my request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to a banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said. So she still doesn't present the request. I think she was still nervous. That's the feeling I get from the scripture, is that she was still nervous to ask for what she was going to ask. And she says, it sounds like she's building up to it even. She's like, if I found favor in your sight, if you still like me, if you still want to grant my petition, come to a banquet that I'll prepare for tomorrow. And then I'll tell you what my request is. And so that's where we see. And so Haman and the king, they leave Esther's banquet and they're heading out. And in verse 9, we kind of change scenes a little bit. It says, so Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, and he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and he called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she has prepared. And tomorrow I am again invited by her, along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. It's interesting because, first of all, when Haman left the banquet out of the king's palace, Mordecai was sitting in the gate. Last we saw of Mordecai, he wasn't in the king's gate because he was wearing sackcloth. He was in mourning. But evidently, sometime during those 3 days, he felt enough release that he took off his sackcloth, and now he's back in his position at the gate where he's supposed to be, doing his job, whatever judgments the king had appointed him to, or even Queen Esther. And so he's back in the gate. Maybe he just wanted to see the result of Esther's going before the king, because he could see it from where he was. The king saw the inner court, He was facing the front of the house. Maybe he wanted to see, after that, he wanted to see what would happen. What is she doing? Because there's no indication that Mordecai knew what Esther's plan was and how she was going to ask. And so at this point, he's sitting in the gate again, and Haman comes out. He's joyful. He's happy. He comes, and he sees Mordecai. Everyone else stands up and bows to him. Mordecai just sits there and looks at him. He's filled with indignation. He can't stand Mordecai. So he goes home, and he calls his friends and his wife Zeresh, and he tells them, oh, look how great I am. Look at all this money I have. After all, I'm about to offer hundreds of tons of silver to the king. I've got all this money. I've got all this wealth. I have all this property. I have this stuff. And all these kids, look at how promoted I am. And not only that, I am the only person that the queen wanted with her and the king. And not only that, tomorrow there's another banquet, and once again, it's just me and the king with Queen Esther. That's how great I am. But all of it is like nothing to me because I can see Mordecai sitting there, not groveling at my feet. You know, people say you can't buy happiness. That's not true. You can buy happiness. You can't buy joy, though. Haman had happiness in all the stuff he had. He was happy that he had all this stuff, that he had these multitude of children, that he had all this wealth. He was happy about it. But he didn't have joy because what Haman desired most was power. And he wanted people to see him as the power. He wanted influence over other people. He wanted them to bow before him and to grovel at his feet. And the one person that wouldn't was more influential in his life than all of the stuff he had. He had the happiness, but he didn't have the joy. And so he's there. He's like, as long as he's there and he doesn't bow before me, all of the stuff I have is like nothing to me. So look what happens in verse 14. It says, then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let gallows be made 50 cubits high, 75 feet. 75 feet high. And in the morning, suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. This thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. He had gallows made, 75 feet tall. Think of how tall that is. A 2-story building is around 20 to 30 feet. 75 feet tall. That's a 5-story building? That's how high they wanted everyone to see Mordecai hanging from the gallows. Chapter 6, verse 1, it says, that night the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king, and it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. Of course, this is the story of Esther chapter 2. When Esther had just become queen, she appointed Mordecai to sit at the gate and do judgments, and he heard this rumor. And so he told everyone, and it was written in the Chronicles. It's all in chapter 2. We've covered that. And the king's like, well, what did we do to honor him? And they said, nothing. There's nothing recorded here that you did anything for him. Now, Herodotus, who was a historian from back then, an ancient historian, wrote down that it was a point of pride and a point of honor with the Persian kings to do something grand for those who helped them in some way. It was a point of honor, and he hadn't done anything. And so now he's like, what do you mean? I didn't do anything? And so in verse 4, so the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest to the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's servant said to him, Haman is here, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. This is interesting because remember the situation we have. The king is trying to fall asleep. He can't sleep. So he has the boring records read to him. Haman comes at a time when the king is trying to sleep. That's the access that Haman had to the king. That's how high up he was. Not only that, Haman had just entered the outer court of the king. So he's almost in the place where it's death to come if he hasn't been called. And so they're like, well, Haman just got here. And the king says, bring him in. The king's in bed. Haman's coming to his bedchamber. I'm sure Haman thought, this is the power I've got. I can even go into the king's inner chamber with him. No one else has this kind of access except the servants. So I'm sure he's happy about it. And in verse 6 it says, so Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Now, notice that there was no greeting. The king is so intent on fixing the fact that he never honored Mordecai for saving his life, that as soon as Haman walks in, he says, what should I do for the man whom the king desires to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? After all, I have access into his very presence when he's trying to go to sleep. As soon as I walk into the outer court, they bring me into the inner court and into his bedchamber. I mean, he's got reasons to think this. He's very high up and he's very favored by the king, but he has no idea what's happening. He walks in. The second he walks in, the king says, what should I do for the man whom I delight to honor? And Haman's going, well, that's got to be me. No one has the honors that I have. And so he says in verse 7, says, and Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Of course, this is a very high honor, to wear a robe that the king has worn, to ride the horse that the king uses. I mean, people recognized horses back then. It's kind of like, hey, that's Nathaneal's car. I can tell that's Nathaneal's car. That kind of thing. And so they're like, the king's horse is only ridden by the king. Otherwise, that person dies, And so you'll see the same thing whenever David is making Solomon king. He has him ride on David's, I don't know if it was a mule or if it was the horse, I forget which, but it was David's animal that Solomon rode on to be anointed as king. And so it was a symbol. And so Haman says, you need to get a robe that you've worn that everyone recognizes as your robe. Let him wear it. You need to let him ride the horse that everyone recognizes as yours. That it even has the royal crest on its head. And then let the best, noblest prince that you have, which is ironic because Haman is the most honored person at the moment. He says, have him parade him around the city square, proclaiming, this is what shall be done for the man to whom the king delights to honor. Haman didn't ask for riches because he had riches. He wanted power and influence. And this is the ultimate scene for power and influence. And so the king says, that's great. Look at verse 10. It says, then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone that you have spoken. And I'm sure Haman's face fell. But we have another issue here. Do so for Mordecai the Jew. He knew Mordecai was a Jew. He just let Haman sign a decree that kills every Jew in the entire empire that he has. And now he's saying, I want you to honor this Jew more than anyone else has been honored since I've been king. To me, in my opinion, I believe that the king had no idea of the extent of the letter and law that Haman had written. He had no clue. Haman never mentioned it was Jews, if you remember. He just said, there's a people in your kingdom. They don't follow your laws. They don't follow your dictates. They're different from everyone. We ought to just kill them all off. And the king said, oh, okay, here's the ring. Go ahead and write the law. No idea who it is. The king's not paying attention. And so Mordecai is sitting in the king's gate. Could you imagine what he was thinking whenever Haman walks up to him with a royal robe and the royal horse? Mordecai is probably going, I'm either about to die or I'm about to be honored. I don't know which. It's going to be great either way. I'm either going to have this great death or I'm going to have this great honor. I don't know what's happening because he wants to kill me. But look at what he's carrying. He walks up to him. And in verse 11, it says, so Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback throughout the city square and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor all around the city. And I'm sure Mordecai is sitting all proud and tall on that horse, looking down at Haman going, and you wanted me to bow before you. All right? All this stuff is going on. And he's proclaiming it throughout the city square. Everyone sees it. Everyone knows what's happening. And it says, afterward, in verse 12, afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered, so no one could see who it was who was running through the streets. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. Now, Mordecai went back to his position. He went back to his job. I'm sure with a little bit of a arrogant step, a little bit, maybe, a little bit proud, walks in. Because remember, all the other people who sit at the gate were the ones that told on him to Haman to see what would happen. So I'm sure he walked up and he says, this is what happens whenever I don't bow before him. And I don't know. But I can imagine him walking in and everyone else going, we don't even know what to say. We were trying to get you in trouble, and Haman is obviously your servant now. We're not sure what's going on. We don't know. Evidently, the king likes you quite a bit. We don't know what's going on. But Haman, of course, covers his head so he couldn't be seen. And he hurries back to his house in mourning. He's like crying. He's weeping. He's bitter. And he gathers all his friends and his counselors and his wife, and he tells them all that happened. And the same people that told him to build a gallows 75 feet tall to hang Mordecai on says, if Mordecai is a Jew and you've begun to fall before him, you're just going to keep falling. You will not prosper. Now, some commentaries don't actually believe that his wife and counselors actually said this. They believe that the writer of the book of Esther is putting words into their mouth that the Jewish belief of the ultimate victory above the Amalekites. Remember, if we believe that Haman is the descendant of Agag, the Amalekite king, This is the ultimate victory over the Amalekites. I tend to believe the writer was writing true. Otherwise, we have things in the Bible that we can't believe. So I believe that they actually said it, but I don't believe they thought about it until they saw the degree of the king's favor to Mordecai, that he would have Haman honor Mordecai that much. And so while they're talking to him and trying to comfort him, and he's in there mourning, it says, in verse 14, while they were still talking to him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. He was in such mourning and so upset about this, he forgot to get ready for the banquet where he thinks he's got this great honor. And I know we look at this and we say today is Easter, the day we celebrate Jesus' victory over sin, death, and the grave, and we have our salvation. But whenever we read this story, Mordecai was about to die. Haman was about to kill him. Esther fasted for 3 days. Isn't it interesting how often 3 shows up in the Bible? The same number that Jonah was in the whale, the same number that Esther fasted and prayed, was the same number of days that Christ stayed in the grave. And on Easter morning, Resurrection Sunday, he stepped out of the grave. It was a redemption for mankind. God has been redeeming the people of Israel in a physical sense since they became a people. He called out Abraham out of Mesopotamia. He called him out of Canaan and into Egypt to save their lives through Joseph. He redeemed them out of that famine. He redeemed them out of Egypt whenever it became bad for them. He redeemed them into the promised land under Joshua. And just over and over, we see the redemption. And in Esther, he redeemed the people. And then he died on the cross and redeemed mankind. While he was on earth, he was rejected by the Jewish people. Completely rejected. And during that time, he actually told a parable. And it was the parable of the wicked vine dressers, the people who rented out a vineyard from a lord. And at the time of harvest, he sent servants and messengers, and they rejected them all. They killed some, they beat others, and they sent them away empty-handed every time. And Jesus said, at last, the landowner said, I will send my son, for surely they will honor my son. So he sent his son, but instead the wicked the renters looked and said, here's the son. If we kill him, we can take the inheritance. And they killed the son. And Jesus asked, what will the Lord do? What will the master do? He will bring his armies. He will destroy those wicked men and lease the vineyard to people, others that will give him his due in the right season. This is the story of salvation. God talked to the nation of Israel from starting with Abraham. And he's been trying to get them to truly be his people throughout history, over and over and over again. And they rejected prophet after prophet after prophet. And finally, he sent his son, whom they killed by hanging on a cross. They put him in the tomb. But 3 days later, on a Sunday morning, it says early in the morning, the women came to dress the body of Jesus. And when they came, the stone was already moved out of the way. The angel was sitting on the stone. And I love it. It says that the angel said, "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" See, he sent his son, and those vine dressers killed him. And that opened up a way for others to come into the kingdom. Jesus was sent, and the Jewish people killed him. And although that was a horrible thing, and Jesus chose to do it, because remember, he said, "No man takes my life from me. Freely I lay it down, and if freely I lay it down, I can pick it back up again." But he chose to let it happen. Why? So that we, who are not physically Abraham's descendants, can be, as Paul said, grafted into the tree of Israel. We are Israel. If you have been saved, if you've been bought with the blood, if you've confessed your sins, you are in the people of God. You have been adopted in, and we are his family. That's what today is all about. We've seen it throughout history with the nation of Israel, where God has redeemed them over and over and over again, because he loves, and he loves, but he is also a just God. He has to judge. But as Paul said, their falling away means salvation for all peoples. If you don't know Jesus, if you have something in your heart or in your life that is preventing you, some sin, anything that keeps you away from Jesus is a sin. If you have anything in your heart, Jesus said all you have to do is accept me, ask for forgiveness, turn away from your sin, and you have salvation. That's it. That's all you need. Doesn't have to be a special prayer. It doesn't have to be something where someone has told you what to say. Your own words work, because God loves to hear your voice. I would encourage you, confess that today. Today we're going to take communion. And that's what these represent. The grape juice represents the blood that he shed. It's the blood of the new covenant. The old covenant was sealed with blood. The blood of bulls and goats. The new covenant is in a holy blood that never had any kind of sin. The old covenant covered up the sin. The new covenant washes it clean. That's the difference. The bread is the body. Jesus' body that was broken for us. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that brought us peace, and by his stripes we are healed. That's what the bread represents. It's broken for us. Jesus chose to be broken so that we can be made whole. That's what this is about. That's what communion is about. And I encourage you, we're going to pass this out. I do communion a little different. I don't like leading communion. I leave it up to you. We're going to pass out the symbols. And that's all they are, is symbols of what he's done. But as you take them, pray. Ask God to search your heart. Ask God to help you search your own heart and see if there's anything you need to get out of your life. And then as you do that and you pray to God to help you, get closer to him. Take the communion, eat the bread, drink the juice, and remember the sacrifice that he's given to you.